Hey everyone, in today's video I'm going to be reviewing this Seicane Android head unit that's installed in my 2004 Mercedes S-Class. I've been using it for over a year and a half and it's been great, so let's take a look at the features. This radio has an 8-core processor, 4 gigs of RAM, and 64 gigs of onboard storage. You can actually option it out a little higher with more storage and more RAM, but this has been fine. There's also another version which has 6 cores, which should also work just fine. Now, as a quick overview, this unit is one of the factory style replacements, so it has buttons, it has volume controls on the dial, and all that built in, so you do trade off a slightly smaller screen for something that looks like it could have come from the factory. It also retains a CD player, which is nice to have if you like that. The way this radio is installed, it uses the factory amplifier using an adapter that converts the sound output from the radio to an optical signal that runs to the trunk where the amp is. It also has GPS built in and Wi-Fi. The way it ties into the car also communicates with CAN bus, so it will read some of the car's systems, like when I put the car in reverse. It'll automatically switch to the backup camera if you install one. Or when I open a door, it'll actually show that on the screen. And when the headlights are on, it will switch to dim the screen, and in Android Auto, we'll switch to night mode. Now let's take a look at what apps are included. We've got navigation, so the built-in GPS, radio, a music player, Z-Link, which we'll get to later for Android Auto and Apple CarPlay, a DVD player using the disk drive, Bluetooth functionality, file browsers, some pretty standard Android apps. But we have AutoKit, wheel key study, amplifier settings, video in, APK installer if you want to load apps without going through the App Store, TPMS apps, GPS test apps, radio related, DAB+, instructions for the unit, SiriusXM, video apps, Spotify, and another TPMS app. Now let's take a look through the different apps. Navigation is the built-in GPS. Now, as you can see, this does work. It's a pretty old school built-in GPS, but it's good to have as a fallback. The GPS antenna does work, even though I left it inside the dash, so that's good to know. And I haven't used this because I usually use Android Auto, but it is nice to have. Now the radio, the way this car works, the radio antenna is tied into the amplifier at the rear of the car, and the antenna is built into the rear windshield. So none of the connections tie in to the new head unit, so unfortunately the radio, as I have installed it, does not work. The best way to get it to work would be to get an aftermarket radio antenna that would plug in behind here and then install up at the top of your windshield, and that would give you radio functionality. Now for music, there's no music on board, but this is a pretty standard music player. Good to have if you plan on using it that way. Now the DVD app serves to use the CD player for music, and it also works for DVDs. Z-Link is pretty interesting. It'll support Android Auto and Apple CarPlay, and I actually have it come to this screen automatically every time I start the car, because 99% of the time I'm going to be plugging my phone in. Now from my experience, it doesn't always connect immediately, but once it's connected, I don't have any issues. And so usually the splash screen on Android Auto is going to be your GPS, but you have access to all sorts of apps based on what's installed on your phone. Really nice to have, and it gives you up-to-date stuff, voice control, and all that. Now the way this is connected on my car, I actually ran the 2 USB plugs that come out of the back of the head unit into this compartment right here. So they both come in here, and I've got my USB-C cable for Android plugged in there, and that's tucked away. It comes out here. One day I'll probably see about running those cables into the center console, but for now, this works great. Now plugging in a lightning cable, I can show you that Z-Link also works for Apple CarPlay by plugging in an iPhone. Now just like in Android Auto, the compatible apps on your phone will be displayed here and you can use them with the screen. And one thing you probably want to know is, how hard is it to install? Well, it's not too bad. I think one of the most difficult parts is actually connecting the CAN bus wires, which tie in under the driver footwell, and running those up. The rest, removing it's pretty straightforward. You have a couple screws in the ashtray area. Then this pops out. You have to pry out this wood trim. And then there's 4 screws that hold the factory unit in, and those same 4 screws will hold this replacement unit in. Now, since this unit is compatible with older cars as well, it does come with replacement fake wood pieces to go around the HVAC controls and the top piece. One of the reasons I actually chose to go for this route was to retain the wood trim, because this is not the most common version of the wood option in this car, and to keep the factory look, I really did want to try to keep these trim pieces in place. Seicane does make a head unit that is a full screen here, but when you use that, it does replace this with a fake wood grain that would have been a different color in this car. If you don't care about that, that's no problem. You can just install it. You're going to get all the same features with a much bigger screen. As I mentioned earlier, you can retain the factory amplifier if you use a Fiber Optic converter box. The options on the listing are here and here, with the corresponding model years. So 2000 to 2003 for pre-facelift and 0405 for the facelift models. If you're unsure what your car is equipped with, the product pages for each one show the connector styles. So with the facelift model, which is what I used, these are the connectors that are compatible. And with the pre-facelift, this is the type of connector you're looking for. If you're not sure what your car is equipped with, I recommend pulling your factory head unit and looking at what connectors are in the back of the original unit. Now you'll notice that on the pre-facelift converter box there is an additional connection, which is D2B wake up, and there's also a couple other things to do in the install for that, which include bypassing the CD changer and closing the fiber optic loop. Some commenters on my install video did use this head unit in their pre-facelift car, and it works. Now if you don't want to use the converter box, there is an option to get wiring that'll allow you to run directly from the head unit to the amplifier in the trunk, and that's this option here. There are videos out there to show how to do that, but since I didn't go that route, I didn't look into it much. Now if your car did not come with the fiber optic system with the amplifier in the trunk, the harness that you get will plug in directly behind the head unit, and it should look like this. If you want to see more details on the installation, I did make a video about this when I first installed it, and I've used it as is ever since. Now let's dive a little bit into the settings. When you open your settings app in here, it's very standard Android controls. But what you're going to want to look at is car, and these are some of the settings that are specific to the head unit. So element is your colors. If you want to take a close look, what I did here was to match the slightly orange glow that all the factory buttons have. So HVAC, anytime you're at night, I did my best to match that in so that it just is seamless and looks as factory as possible. So if you want to take a closer look, that is kind of what you're looking at. So about halfway in the red and a tiny bit of green, and that brings it into the orange. Amplifier will bring you to the EQ app. This is what I came up with for my preferences for this car. Pretty flat, it sounds quite good. And I've set it like that, and it's been like that since I installed it. For navigation, we have some sound mode settings. You can choose your default navigation. Your driving settings, allow to watch video while driving, that's up to you. And then extra settings in here, shut down delay when accessory off, if you want the radio to stay on longer. You got reversing mirror, reversing volume, Now, reversing volume is when you put it in reverse, does it drop the volume? I like it to stay constant, especially if I'm starting a podcast. When I'm leaving, I don't want it to drop down in volume, so I want to be able to hear. If I want to turn it down, I'll just do it myself. You know, trajectory display, ruler, those are when you're in reverse. If you have a backup camera installed, it'll show guides, that kind of thing. Now, if we go into factory settings, this unit needs a password. And from the documentation, it's 126. And that brings us to a bunch more settings. Here you can choose what CarPlay app you want to use. I've been using Z-Link. You got car logo. You can choose your animation. You can actually go for a custom one if you plug in a flash drive. But right now it just shows the radio's brand. You got radio settings. Probably would help if I was in the American radios, even though I don't have the antenna. Voice settings. I haven't touched these. CAN bus, standard here. I haven't touched this since it works well for me as it was from the factory. Screen calibration is here. Key study, so if you want to reset the steering wheel control buttons, change stuff, you can mess around with that in here. It works for me, so I haven't touched it. Then in other, we've got some brightness adjustments. Again, panel LED control, that's the built-in LEDs will turn on when you turn on the headlights, just like everything else. When you save your factory settings, the unit reboots, which gives you the chance to see the default loading animations right here. Now let's talk about some of the limitations. As I mentioned earlier, the radio without an extra antenna won't work because it won't use the factory antenna. There's also a little bit of alternator hum that comes in, which I believe comes through the fiber optic converter box. I've been able to mitigate it a little bit, but I'm going to be trying some more things to do that. It's really not noticeable when you're listening to something, but it kind of rises in pitch with the revs, so something to keep in mind. When you make a phone call, there's an overlay that covers the bottom of the screen, and that can interfere with your use of Android Auto or Apple CarPlay, but since you're in your phone call, usually it's not a big deal. Just something to keep in mind so you know what to expect. Now, what I've heard in some comments after posting my install video is that the steering wheel controls can cause some issues. On the S-Class, we've got the standard controls are volume up, down, pick up and hang up the phone, and then your 4 controls here that control your display. And as you may be able to hear, I'm getting some beeping. And it's because these controls will be picked up by the radio. Now, volume works on the steering wheel, which is really nice. If I hang up the phone, it'll actually go to the phone app, which is, can be useful. Now here, if I'm navigating the in-dash menus using the arrows, it's also affecting built-in apps, such as the radio. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. However, when you're in Android Auto, those same controls, the up and down arrows on the steering wheel to cycle through the menus, they don't affect anything in Android Auto. So your volume works, you can navigate your in-dash screen, and you don't have to worry about anything. And that's why I recommend using Android Auto with this, and that is why I got this radio, was to use Android Auto and get modern features in this really good but almost 20-year-old car. Now, if you had the voice controls on your car, if I push this out, it'll open the GPS app. If I pull it in, it mutes things. Something that a lot of people have asked as well is, does this communicate with the dash screen? So what I'm talking about here is the factory navigation, telephone, and audio. And unfortunately, it does not communicate with the radio like that. Any instructions from navigation will not be carried over here, and audio information will also not be displayed in your dash. So you're gonna have to look over here. Do I recommend this radio? Yeah, definitely. It's a huge upgrade over the factory one. And even though I did lose the tape player that came with the factory unit, It's not something I use, honestly. It does come with a lot of the onboard features that you can expect from an Android tablet, plus some more specific to a radio application. And the included Z-Link app is super helpful to use Android Auto and Apple CarPlay. Once you're set up, especially if you're using Android Auto, you get a bunch of modern features that you didn't have before. You get Bluetooth. To make phone calls, I actually have the microphone run up to the top of the windshield right here. And it's been really great. And having the factory style buttons, you know, previous next track ties into Android Auto as well, you know, play pause as well. That's really nice to have. I do like having some traditional style buttons, and for me, this was the way to go. Now, I'm not sponsored by Seicane, but if you want to check out the product page for this radio, I'll be leaving a link in the video description. Be sure to check out my install video for this unit, and subscribe if you want to see car radio upgrades, radio reviews, and other car projects. If you have any questions, leave a comment, and if you enjoyed this review, leave a like. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.